Many people will believe that owning a cottage is a great financial investment. What's the reality of that situation?
So like any investment property, or any investment, I should say, there's going to be some positive outcomes, but it's not always straightforward. And there are a lot of considerations that you really want to think about before you determine that, is this the right choice for you? So for example, there are a lot of costs associated with ownership of a property, and you really don't want to underestimate those costs: property taxes, repair costs, maintenance fees, and especially with a lot of the Canadian cottages that we have that are exposed to the elements. Again, you really don't want to be underestimating those costs. Additionally, when you own a cottage, if there's a disposition, whether you own that property at passing or you were to sell that property, you could incur a capital gain tax, and that may significantly undercut any profit that you were expecting. You know, if you're only using a cottage for a few weeks out of the year and you're not actually also renting it out, you know, it may cost you more than the benefit of ownership, and it may in fact be more economic if you think about renting the property, renting a cottage for the times that you actually need it. But, you know, even if you do decide to own a property and rent it out to, you know, offset some of those costs, that brings another host of headaches that you perhaps want to consider, such as the fact that it can be very time consuming and stressful to find a reliable tenant, to deal with property damages that some of the tenants may in fact, you know, deal with your cottage. You know, another thing to keep in mind is that there are certain income tax deductions that are denied on income earned for short-term rentals if they're not complying with certain provincial and municipal restrictions. So overall, cottage ownership may not be the guaranteed slam dunk investment that you think it is. For some it can be, for some it may not be.
So lots of important things to consider there. Of course, when people have a cottage in the family, they have the ideas like, maybe I'll hand it down to future generations. So some people think you take the cottage, you put it in joint names with the kids to save on taxes. What's the reality there?
This is one of the most common misconceptions that my clients come to me for. And if you retain one nugget of information from me after today, never, ever, 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 and I can't stress that enough, ever, should a parent add their children on title to any property, let alone a cottage property, without first getting the right legal and tax advice. It is so crucial to get the right legal and tax advice. And the reason for this is, I tend to find that a lot of parents, the reason why they're, choosing to add their children on title is that they want to avoid something called probate fees. And here in Ontario, we do have one of the highest rates here at approximately 1.5%. But the reality is that probate fees pale in comparison to capital gain tax rates. And if that cottage or any home that the parent owned was eligible for the principal residence exemption, because the parent was able to designate that home as their principal residence, when a parent adds their children on title, they are now risking the principal residence exemption, which is obviously not something that we would recommend. But even if the parent can't designate the home as the principal residence, there's still possibly a triggering of a disposition that occurs when the parent adds the children on title. And for parents that want to defer taxes for as long as they can, obviously an immediate tax liability is not something they want to do. In addition to all that, then parents also need to be concerned about when they're adding their children as title, they're adding them as a joint owner, and the creditors of all owners are able to possibly go after that home. And there's actually a really heartbreaking case that came out of BC a few years back where a mom added her son on title for estate planning purposes, likely to avoid BC probate fees, and there was a judgment against the son. And the courts ended up ruling in favor of the creditors that they were able to go after that joint home between the mom and the son, which really underscores the real risks associated with joint ownership. So again, get the right advice before you add any children on title.
A lot to consider there. So some people might be listening to this and say, okay, now maybe I just simply leave the cottage to the kids in the will that keeps it in the family. What do you need to know here?
So it is a common desire that I see that many families, that cottage is so sentimental to the family. It's a cherished family. There's a lot of memories there. It could be where the family reunions happen. The family could have owned that cottage for decades. And the family wants to ensure that that cottage stays within the family. So they think, okay, great, I'm going to transfer it in my will to all of my children. All of the children, retain equal ownership of that, cottage, and it's going to allow that cottage to stay within the family. While in some families that may be successful, unfortunately, at least what I've seen, it probably doesn't happen as successfully as a lot of people think because there's a lot of considerations to consider. So when a parent distributes, the cottage in the will and all of the children own. Yes, they might own an equal percentage of that cottage property, but now you need to decide, how are decisions going to be made about that property in terms of who's going to pay the fees, who's going to deal with the property maintenance, how are taxes going to be paid, how are you going to use that property? When you have multiple siblings owning the home, are friends allowed? Which sibling gets it, which weekends? And even siblings that get along are not going to unanimously agree on all decisions, especially in light of the fact that most siblings have different financial circumstances, living arrangements, different visions for the future. So when you have a family that ends up arguing over these decisions, it may end up costing the family the cottage, and that they may end up having to sell the cottage, which obviously doesn't allow the cottage to remain in the family. But also, when the parent passes away, there's going to be a tax associated with the parent's death. And if there's not enough assets to pay for those taxes, arguably that cottage may have to be sold to pay the taxes that are owed. So there are other alternative strategies to consider that may mitigate some of these, implications, but to determine which strategy, and sometimes it may be trust planning, but whether or not trust planning is right for you or whether or not some other strategy is right for you, that's really where you need to get a comprehensive estate plan put in place.
Only a minute left, but obviously there's lots of complications here. It sounds like you need to speak to someone or maybe somebodies.
Yes, there are a number of different professionals that you want to consider speaking with. A tax professional, a tax accountant, a real estate lawyer, an estate planning lawyer, an advisor, a property manager. These professionals can provide you with tailored advice based on your unique facts and circumstances.